Why can exposure still go wrong even though we're using sophisticated cameras? Now, the answer to this question can be one of those eureka moments for some. It can affect our understanding of light and our photography into the future. Try the exercise that I'm about to describe for yourself using your own camera. Frame up on a white card outside on a sunny day. Completely fill your viewfinder with the card. You can choose aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual exposure. The camera and lens can be any make, model, or focal length. You can use an SLR or a mirrorless camera. It really doesn't matter. The camera's exposure readout when I did this was 5/100ths of a second at f/5.6. But look at the result when we see the image. It's mid-grey, certainly not white. It's clearly underexposed. So what exposure is required to photograph a white card and have it appear as white? Well, we have to increase the exposure by slowing the shutter speed from a 5/100ths of a second to 125th of a second. That's effectively doubling the light falling on the sensor 2 times over. Now let's try exactly the same thing with a black card. The camera's exposure here was a 1/30th of a second at f/5.6. But once again, the result is virtually the same. We have mid-grey, just the same as we saw with the white card. The black card is clearly overexposed. So what do we have to do with the exposure to get the black card to appear as black? Well, here we need to decrease the exposure by speeding up the shutter speed from a 1/30th of a second to 125th of a second. This reduces the light falling on the sensor by half and then half again. Now, when we compare the exposure that's required to record each card correctly, we see that the exposure is exactly the same for both cards. Now, why is that? It's because both cards are being lit by exactly the same light source, in our case, the sun. That light doesn't change whether we're photographing white or black. So we may be asking, why was the exposure the camera selected so wrong? It's simply because the camera reads light reflected from the subject, not light falling on the subject. So subjects with mostly light tones fool the camera's light meter into thinking we need less exposure. Subjects with mostly dark tones fools the camera into thinking we need more exposure than we actually do. So imagine composing a scene where 2/3 of it is in shadow and 1/3 of it is in bright light. We have a potential exposure problem here. Because if we expose for the 2/3 shadows, the highlights may be far too bright. If we expose for the 1/3 highlight, the shadows are almost certainly going to be far too dark. This knowledge was a eureka moment for me, and when the penny finally dropped, it changed my photography for the better from that moment. Our cameras are just dumb machines, and this knowledge helps us to know when we need to step in and take charge. It makes us much more aware of tricky exposures, as some are, and then we tend to learn how to get round them. What's going on here is also one of the main causes of poor quality images. It can impact the photographer's ability to edit their photographs because the incorrect exposure is beyond their editing expertise. It also can cause the noise issues we often battle with, and I could go on and on. When you can look at a scene in front of you, and before you even raise the camera to your eye, you're making an exposure compensation, that's probably a good indicator that your penny has well and truly dropped.